World War I. The British and the German navies face off in the freezing North Sea off the coast of Denmark. The largest sea battle in history ends with the remains of 25 shipwrecks scattered across the ocean bed.
These ghostly images of these huge battleships, these majestic vessels, can't help but make you think about the violence of that day and how many lives were lost.
Now, advances in underwater technology and previously unseen documents are answering questions still being asked more than 100 years after the battle. Why were so many British ships broken in two? And why did the British lose such a high number on that fateful day?
I imagine that the Germans were looking with great glee, not expecting to see British capital ships just coming apart before them. Why is that the case?
Today, experts are out to understand why the greatest ships in the powerful British fleet lie rusting on the seabed in an attack nobody saw coming. Who was to blame? And what were the flaws in the British ships that led to the deaths of thousands?
The ship broke in two. How powerful a force it must have been to destroy these ships. Some of them are just devastated, torn apart. You can understand some of the shock of these British officers as they saw their ships, which they had felt were part of the invincible British naval power, these ships just blowing up.
This was 20th century murderous technology introduced to naval warfare in a new and horrible manner.
The seas and oceans of the world are filled with mysteries. Lost ships and lost lives. Now, with cutting-edge technology, new clues are being uncovered, unraveling these incredible stories and revealing their sunken secrets. Florida-based Chuck Mead is examining footage he has gathered of HMS Queen Mary, which sunk trying to intercept a German force during the Battle of Jutland. He is trying to understand what happened on that bloody day more than 100 years ago.
The main surviving section of the Queen Mary stands pretty proud of the seafloor, higher than many of the other wrecks. You can see wooden decking still survives. You can see a number of shells, massive projectiles that could have weighed up to 2,000 pounds and been fired at a distance of miles away. So these were what made a battleship, gave it its might, its power.
But Chuck's closer examination of the wreck footage reveals something very strange. Much of the ship is completely missing.
The aftermost section is pretty heavily damaged, but it's somewhat intact. The forward section really is almost non-existent other than debris. The ship must have disintegrated with the impact of the explosion.
Chuck has discovered that he's looking at less than half of the 650-foot-long HMS Queen Mary. It seems to have broken in two around the ship's central turret. What went wrong within British command to allow the Germans to all but obliterate this battlecruiser? The First World War had been raging for almost 2 years, but as yet, the British Royal Navy and the German fleet hadn't even faced each other in a decisive battle.
The war in the North Sea had two sets of expectations. Those on the behalf of the Central Powers, who wanted to break out, be able to get supplies from the rest of the world, and keep their commerce alive. The second set of expectations were the Allied powers, to keep the Germans in, to prevent them from getting war material and touching a larger world.
In a move to break the blockades imposed on them, the German fleet launched a deadly ambush on the British.
For the sailors on both sides at Jutland, many of them had not seen combat. They had heard the horrors of trench warfare, which was now becoming World War I's most defining characteristic: instant death.
But the British Navy's response was dogged by mistakes, resulting in massive, unexpected losses. 8,500 men were killed, and that was not all.
Both navies had these massive fleets that had been trained and trained and trained. They were ready for that battle. Jutland provided that. But it wasn't really supposed to be.
In February 1916, the cautious German Admiral von Pohl died. His replacement, Admiral Scheer, was a very different commander who would dramatically alter the shape of the war at sea.
Reinhard Scheer, he wanted to see an aggressive use of submarines and zeppelins supporting a sortie out onto the North Sea of the High Seas Fleet.
Together with his Vice Admiral Franz Hipper, Scheers formed a daring plan to draw out and destroy the British fleet. On May 30th, 1916, the British secretly intercepted messages revealing that the German battlecruiser fleet was heading out to sea. Scheer's plan appeared to be working. A showdown at sea seemed to be close at hand.
We have some of the most advanced ships with some of the largest guns, thousands of sailors, and two empires clashing each other on the high seas.
The British fleet headed out to confront them. Their battlecruiser squadron was commanded by Vice Admiral Beatty, and the Grand Fleet, the most powerful section of the Royal Navy, was under Admiral Lord Jellicoe. Did the characters of these two men contribute to so many British losses? Admiral Jellicoe's grandson, Nicholas Jellicoe, has a fascinating take on the personalities of the two British commanders.
You could not have found two people more different than Jellicoe and Beatty. Jellicoe was a very intelligent man, very cerebral. Beatty, on the other hand, had a very strong charisma.
Yet the two admirals would need to work together if they were to defeat the dynamic new German commander.
British naval forces set out to the North Sea for a meeting point just off the Danish coast. The main battle fleet, coming from Scapa Flow, some other elements from Cromarty, and the battle cruisers from the Firth of Forth. They were sent out at around 9 o'clock in anticipation of meeting a battle cruiser force, which would be coming north into the North Sea.
During the opening phase of the battle, known as the Run to the South, it was Admiral Beatty's fleet that first made contact with the Germans.
When the battle cruisers meet, that's the first act in this play. And that's where you have the run to the south. And that's the British forces chasing the German forces. The strategy of the German High Seas Fleet was to bring the British fleet out piecemeal. They couldn't take them on all at once. They pull them out in bites and eat them, devour them, and move on to the next. Scheer knew that he could not simply go toe-to-toe with the British.
Chuck Meade's mission is to discover just why and how so many British ships were lost.
As we have approached and now surpassed a century since the battle, there's been an increasing interest by divers. So there have been more and more expeditions, more and more divers getting footage. We'll get a changing perspective. And so we'll see things that we haven't seen before, and that may reveal secrets or better understanding of things that we didn't fully understand before.
Today, less than 30 miles from where the British and German navies first made contact, the wrecks of the British ships HMS Indefatigable and HMS Queen Mary lie on the ocean bed. HMS Queen Mary was one of the most modern, best-equipped ships in the Royal Navy. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, she was engulfed in flames and sunk. her loss came as a terrible shock to the British. How did the star of their fleet meet its end?
This was what happened at Jutland. Ships exploded in a mushroom cloud, and in just seconds, mere seconds, thousands of lives were vaporized. For sailors to see that must have been absolutely terrifying. It would have knocked the patriotism right out of their hearts at that moment.
What must have been going through Beattie's mind at this point is hard to tell. But when Queen Mary exploded at 4:26, he turned round to his flag captain and was heard to mutter what now has become a very famous statement: "There's something wrong with our bloody ships today."
So was there actually something wrong? Or did the problem really lie with British Admiral Beattie's own command? What will wreck footage and declassified documents reveal about the sunken British ships of the Battle of Jutland? And what clues can be found to uncover the reasons for their sinking? The Battle of Jutland, off the Danish coast, was one of the biggest battles of World War I. It was supposed to be a crushing British victory, but why were so many British ships sunk? Was it simply bad luck, or was something or someone to blame? Some argue it came down to British Admiral Beattie's terrible timing. He failed to engage the German battle cruisers and threw away a 2-to-1 numerical advantage, instead fighting one-on-one.
Had Beattie just held off a moment, consolidated his forces, he would have entered this engagement with overpowering strength. Had he engaged earlier and used the speed of his ships, he actually probably could have saved both Indefatigable and Queen Mary from their untimely destruction.
But the mysterious explosions of the Queen Mary and the Indefatigable were just the first of the British losses at Jutland. The battle had only just begun. Worse was to come.
There's smoke from all the coal fires. There's smoke from ships on fire. The sun is in some people's eyes, and communications are not being paid attention to. It's hard to see a flag when your ship's on fire.
What the sailors on the British ships didn't know was that Beattie was unwittingly leading them straight into the jaws of the powerful German high seas fleet. Complete disaster was only averted when Beattie received a message from one of his own advanced ships, warning of the danger ahead.
This gave Beattie the vital information he needed. Now he knew he was heading straight into a trap.
That signal probably saved many lives. Yet the message really should have come from the Admiralty. Recently declassified documents reveal that the British actually had a huge advantage over the Germans that day. Historian Guy Walters is uncovering long-forgotten secrets from the British National Archives. His mission is to discover how and why the British were able to decipher and decode German messages. He finds that the answer lies with an unexpected event that occurred 2 years before the Battle of Jutland.
In August 1914, the German warship, the HMS Magdeburg, runs aground off the coast of Finland. And it's boarded by some Russians, and on board they find 3 code books. Now, I've got a copy of one of them here. Now, until that point, the British had no idea of how to decrypt German signals traffic. But when you've got a book like this gives you all the secrets. It's like a cheat sheet. Now, this is sent to a room in the Admiralty, a very secret room called Room 40.
The British could scarcely believe their luck.
Here we go. So we've got 36AXK, and that means ventilation shaft. You just have to go through it. It's basically almost every word in the German language is here, and the code for it. And of course, the Germans had no clue that the British had it. So they might as well have been shouting at each other just in plain English, frankly, because the Brits knew everything they were saying. This is absolutely invaluable in a time of war.
So the British could and should have been able to tell their ships exactly what was going on. But there was a setback that would have tragic consequences.
Part of the problem with signals intelligence, as it was back then, was that the Admiralty's operations division and the code breakers were not very closely integrated.
And so, at Jutland, the wrong questions were being asked by the British Navy, and the wrong answers were being given by the code breakers. Not only that, but the Germans were also giving false call signs to confuse British intelligence. So despite the British decoding the German messages and orders, this vital information failed to get to where it was most needed. But how did this failure contribute to the wrecks we see today? And why are there so many sunken British ships? During the largest naval battle in history, the British and German fleets played cat and mouse to try and gain the upper hand in the freezing North Sea. The result was the greatest number of sunken wrecks in any one area at the time. While the British had the correct intelligence, why wasn't it getting to the men who needed it most? It was now up to Beatty to think on his feet. He ordered a 180-degree turn, heading north towards the British Grand Fleet, commanded by Admiral Jellicoe. Behind Beatty, the Germans followed in hot pursuit. Beatty then made a huge mistake. He didn't think to inform Jellicoe what he was doing.
Jellicoe actually signals him and says, so where is the enemy battle fleet? I can hear this firing going on, but I don't know precisely where it is. He doesn't get any information.
It was only down to Jellicoe's judgment and another slice of luck that he was able to break the Germans' pursuit of Beatty, surrounding the enemy with a semicircle of guns. The Germans were suddenly faced by a 5-mile line of British battleships, about to turn their firepower upon them.
This was the last thing that they wanted to see, was the entire Grand Fleet assembled in front of them. And when out of a fog bank appeared more naval firepower than had ever been assembled on the high seas before. Admiral Jellicoe had the upper hand. He had the weather gauge. He had the sun to his back. He had the Germans to his front, and was able to bring the full might of his guns down on Admiral Scheer and pound them into pieces. Now the real battle had just begun.
If that was the case, why are so many British ships littered on the seabed? The reason for this was a remarkable German tactical maneuver.
Frankly, at this point, Scheer did something that was incredibly gutsy. He ordered what he called a battle turn. And the battle turn was an idea that each ship would turn on its own position, not one after the other, but all of them at the same time, away from the British line, away from the British guns, and frankly, back into the mist. So Jellicoe was looking at available gunnery targets one moment, and then 4 minutes later, there was nothing. It was just mist. Essentially, this was like a fast handbrake turn in a car.
Now, the guns of the German Navy were turned back on the British fleet, and the results were catastrophic. 2 salvos struck HMS Defense, her magazine exploded, and she rapidly sank. Not a single member of her 900-strong crew survived. HMS Defense was just one of many British ships lost that day. Along with the Queen Mary and the Indefatigable, HMS Invincible was hit by 3 salvos from German ships, and she sunk within 90 seconds. Their wrecks lie at Jutland still. Why did these mighty ships, the pride of the British Navy, sink so quickly? The dramatic images of Invincible's sinking suggest that she, like HMS Queen Mary, had broken in two. Chuck is now examining detailed modern footage of the wreck, looking for clues and for answers.
Pretty intact, though. There's a lot of scattered wreckage around, what looks like cables, and I can see sections of plating and things like that. It's a mess, definitely. There's a lot of stuff. I mean, you know, probably some of the superstructure has collapsed.
Chuck finds some clues around the ship's central turret.
The roof of the turret is missing. Once the turret was penetrated, the explosion was powerful enough that it tore the ship into two pieces. So what we're seeing in the video footage corroborates the historical account that you know, the roofs of the turret were blown off in the force of the explosion, which was powerful enough to rip the ship into two pieces, you know, much like the Queen Mary.
Like the Queen Mary, HMS Invincible seems to have been the victim of an enormous turret explosion. Chuck tries to piece together what might have happened.
Well, these are smaller guns than some of the others we've seen, probably these 7.5-inch guns. It looks like the roof of the turret is blown off, which makes sense if we know the magazines caught fire and exploded.
If both ships suffered a similar fate, why does the wreck of the Defense look so very different?
At least some of the vessel looks somewhat intact for the way it was sunk. Again, there's a lot of tangled, broken wreckage, but I could see large parts of the deck where the wooden decking was still in place.
The differences in damage to the wrecks lie in their designs. The main magazines on Queen Mary, Indefatigable, and Invincible were located in the center of the ships. It is most likely that the huge explosions here caused the ships to break in two. But HMS Defense had 9.2-inch turrets at the front and back. The explosion, rather than breaking the ship in two, destroyed both ends of the ship, leaving the middle on the ocean floor. There is now another question to be answered. Did the design of the ships contribute to their doom? The wrecks of World War I's largest naval battle are scattered beneath the depths of the North Sea. Now, expert analysis and new technology begin to reveal that the reason could have been an unseen flaw in the British ship's design. The evidence from dive footage suggests there were weak spots around the turrets. Andrew Chung is curator at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, London, which holds the original plans for the Queen Mary, the second of the ships to sink.
As you can see from this design drawing, a great many features were worked into ensuring the safety and survivability of this ship. The Queen Mary was one of the better protected of the British battle cruisers. With one exception, she had the strongest side armor. There were multiple levels of safety designed to keep out and minimize physical damage, but also the damage through fire, which was the greatest fear in a space where lots of ammunition would be stored.
The plans confirm that the British ship HMS Queen Mary was built with an array of modern design features to protect it from enemy shells. If the plans and underwater images show that the ship was so well designed, what could have caused it to suddenly explode? HMS Caroline, the last surviving ship of the Battle of Jutland, is docked safely in Belfast in Northern Ireland and could hold the key to what exactly caused the Queen Mary to sink.
So this is the shell rooms. This is where the high explosive 6-inch shells are stored. This was potentially one of the most dangerous places in the ship, full of high explosives. And even today, everything you see in here is absolutely original. This is the ship as she was in 1916. So you can imagine how dangerous it was, how claustrophobic.
If it was in these vulnerable turrets that the explosions occurred, what can HMS Caroline reveal about how deadly shells were handled?
It's an incredibly physical environment on board HMS Caroline. There aren't much in the way of mechanical aids to move things around. It's people physically lifting these shells, putting them on the hoist, moving them up through 3 or 4 decks to get to the guns. They would feel the change of the ship's movement as she changed course. They might hear shell fire in the distance alongside, but fundamentally they don't know what's going on.
The way in which the shells were brought up to the guns on deck was very similar to the much larger Queen Mary.
Ships like Queen Mary were designed with a multi-stage system of passing ammunition from the magazines up into the gun house. Shells at the lowest level would be placed on a hoist. They would then pass through an armored scuttle with a closing fireproof hatch.
As a vital safety measure, the doors on every level should have been closed each time the hoist passed through to act as fireproof barriers. However, this critical safety feature left the ship with a major disadvantage.
The only problem with this system was that it prevented a rapid rate of fire. It was deliberate, it was carefully designed, and it was really meant to ensure the safety of the ship.
It seemed that there was a choice for the British ships: a rapid rate of fire or a compromise in safety. So, did they decide to leave the fire hatches open?
This worked in the sense that it was possible to get shells and cordite bags up into the turret more rapidly, but it also meant that there was now an exposed passage for any fire to travel all the way from the turret gun house right to the magazine at the bottom of the ship.
When the German shells hit the turret, the fire ripped through the open hatches to the ammunition below. Huge explosions tore the ships apart. Queen Mary, invincible and indefatigable, broke down the middle, while in HMS Defense, the explosions ripped off both her ends. The footage from the wreck dive supports the fire hatch theory, but more evidence is still needed to solve the mystery once and for all.
The tragedy for the British was that German systems for cordite handling and safety were not really too dissimilar from theirs, but the crucial difference is the Germans adhered to their rules, and to a large degree, the British did not.
Everything becomes about feeding the guns as fast as possible, and that, of course, on the bigger ships, on the battle cruisers, leads ultimately to disaster.
But was the design of the ship and the tactics employed the reason for the high number of vessels and lives lost? Or were there mistakes higher up the chain of command? An investigation into the shipwrecks of the Battle of Jutland is seeking answers to the mystery of why so many British ships were sunk. While turret explosions destroyed the lead ships, what other factors contributed to the sinking of these doomed vessels? German Admiral Scheer's fleet made 2 charges at the British line, firing a wave of torpedoes. British Admiral Jellicoe's response provided the war with one of its greatest controversies.
My grandfather has been most criticized, probably, for what he then did. He decided to turn the ships of the Grand Fleet away from a threat, the torpedo threat that was unleashed. This is not in the Nelson tradition of closing with the enemy. He'd even said that he knew he would probably incur the odium of the public because it might be misunderstood.
Jellicoe seemed to be playing it safe.
He can be criticized for other things, but on this I think he was right.
As night fell, both the British and the Germans headed south.
He feels that any superiority he has is probably going to be risked by the chance of a night engagement. His fleet hasn't trained in night tactics, and the searchlights that they use are definitely inferior to the German Iris searchlight.
Jellicoe positioned a screen of destroyers to protect his ships until first light.
Now at night you have these destroyers that are crossing in and amongst each other. You have ships dashing about. These are pre-radar days. It was hard to see who was who at night, and relying on visual signals, blinker lights and all of that, and fog and smoke. Chaos of battle, that the fleet action by night magnified the horrors of the day.
How would his ships rejoin the battle in the morning? The key was to cut off the Germans' route back to port, but it wasn't straightforward. As commander of the German High Seas Fleet, Admiral Scheer had many options. Which one would he choose?
One of those options might be for him to actually tail back and go up to the Skaw and then through the Skagerrak into the Baltic and back to Kiel. One other alternative might be heading south.
Jellicoe made the decision to block Scheer's direct route to Wilhelmshaven.
So Jellicoe's really put all his eggs into one basket. He thinks that there's going to be the possibility of an engagement with the German fleet as light comes back, anywhere after 2:30 in the morning.
But Scheer had other ideas.
What he decides to do is to actually cut across Jellicoe's blocking line and try and get his ships back into the Horns Reef and then back in behind the protective minefields.
As Jellicoe and Beatty commanded the British forces to head south, Admiral Scheer was able to smash his way through the rear of the British line and head back to port. The hunt was over. The Germans had escaped. Perhaps Jellicoe had made a fatal misjudgment, but in the National Archives in London, historian Guy Walters has found documents revealing that the blame may not have rested entirely with him.
What you've got over here are all the decrypts received and translated, and this is the Battle of Jutland in real time. This is what the Germans are saying to each other, and it's decoded almost on the spot and then sent to the Navy for them to evaluate. This is as good, in modern terms, as having a drone right above your enemy. You can see exactly what they're up to, but you can also see what the enemy is planning to do. You can see into the future.
Questions remain. If the British had the vital decoded German messages, then how were they unable to avenge their losses that day and allow the enemy to escape? Can an investigation into the wrecks of Jutland solve the mysteries surrounding World War I's bloodiest naval battle? Why did British Admiral Jellicoe not act upon decoded German messages sent to him by British intelligence?
The German fleet are heading in a kind of south-southeasterly direction to a place called Horns Reef. Our main body proceed course south-southeast to Horns Reef. Be assembled by 4 a.m. at Horns Reef on course around Squaw. On and on they go.
There was little room for doubt. Admiral Scheer, commander of the German High Seas Fleet, was ordering his forces towards Horns Reef.
Now, I'm looking at all these signals. Admiral Jellicoe should have been looking at all these signals, but he never did. Because what happens to them, they get decrypted in room 40, they get passed to Admiralty operations, and it's they who decide which signals that Jellicoe gets. Now, extraordinarily, operations sit on most of these signals. There are 16 signals here which say Horns Reef. It couldn't be more explicit, but they only sent 3 to Jellicoe.
Given the problems with decoded messages from Admiralty operations earlier in the battle, Jellicoe probably didn't entirely trust them.
Why doesn't he trust operations? Because earlier in the day, operations had said to him, oh, don't worry, you know, the German fleet, it's all at port still. And he's now run into it. So he's thinking, anything I'm hearing from operations is probably nonsense, so I'm going to ignore it.
There were captains on other destroyers who could see perfectly well what Scheer was doing. Unfortunately, their sightings weren't reported to Jellicoe.
The most crucial element of the night actions is that the destroyers on the whole failed to report what was happening to them. And it was only shortly before 3 in the morning that a proper contact report with a position was actually dispatched by the last British ships to engage the Germans.
As the German Navy began arriving back in port and dawn broke over the North Sea, Jellicoe realized that he'd been hoodwinked. Back in Britain, the people were faced with an uncomfortable truth. The British Navy was no longer the only major power at sea.
Jutland has always had a very controversial place inside British naval history. Initially, it was to do with the expectations of the British public. I mean, they'd been awaiting a Trafalgar-like victory, and when this wasn't the case, that immediately set the scene.
An unfortunate consequence of this was that returning British sailors were booed and jeered. Some had things thrown at them in the streets. The vast swathes of the British public were convinced that the Navy had lost the battle and had let them down.
The Battle of Jutland shook the confidence of Britain. It was indecisive at first. The Royal Fleet comes back, and they're minus 14 ships. They're minus 6,700 sailors. How do you declare a victory when you suffer 3/4 of the loss of the battle? And that was something that at first was attempted to be covering up, knowing that it would shake the foundations of British involvement in World War I.
More than 100 years later, all we have left are the wrecks and the now declassified documents. They alone hold the key to understanding why a battle that was supposed to deliver a British victory turned into a humiliating nightmare. Those involved are all, of course, long gone. But the ships that were once powerful symbols of British naval might are still there, albeit deep beneath the waves, and they are gradually revealing their secrets and the answers to questions that have echoed down the years. The reputations of men such as Admirals Jellicoe and Beatty are still held within those wrecks.
What was reprehensible about the postscript of Jutland was the vitriolic war of words that went on between the two camps of followers, Jellicoe's and Beatty's.
The new footage of the wrecks reveals the flaws in ship design which contributed to the sinking of the ships. These would never have been acknowledged at the time when the Navy was casting around for reasons to explain what happened at Jutland. The fact that vital signals intelligence was not passed on to Jellicoe would not be revealed until the documents themselves became declassified many years later. And the turret explosions, caused by poor weapons practice, were blamed on the ships themselves.
The nature of naval warfare was changing so rapidly with technology that some of the basic tenets of good communication and naval gunnery were forgotten. The fog of war, the introduction of massive new types of technology helped cripple the British fleet at Jutland, preventing the concise victory they sought, and the same for the Germans.
The status quo was the same the very next day. The British really had to push to try to tell their population that they still controlled the seas. Britannia still ruled the waves.
In the short term, the British re-armored a lot of their ships, sending them in for refits to have extra armor placed over the crowns of the magazines. And this was a bit of a waste of time because in practical terms, the extra armor applied to many of these ships would not have prevented the same sort of damage from happening again.
It was the deciding battle for both sides, and it resulted in changes in naval technology, naval gunnery, and how we commit war against each other. The Battle of Jutland was a clash of titans. It was the greatest naval battle of World War I.
Modern underwater technologies have given a fresh insight into the events of this battle and have helped piece together the mystery of how these ships came to lie beneath the waves of the North Sea.
As the wrecks continue their unstoppable, slow demise, as bulkheads collapse and iron plating falls off, that will reveal things that we couldn't otherwise easily see. So continuing to dive on these shipwrecks, continuing to try to understand their current physical condition and what that tells us about the details of their sinking, we will continue to learn more about the Battle of Jutland from these ghost hulks that still survive at the bottom of the sea.
As for Admiral Jellicoe, he fell out of favor with the Navy and retired, and his job was taken by the ambitious Beatty. His reputation and the stories of the stricken ships that sealed it may well have been sunk forever.